You know what Harry Potter is. I don't have to explain it to you. We're going to talk about the economics in the book. How does the money work? How does the banking industry work? How much money can you make as a wizard? And so much more. But the big question is, why do you care what I have to say about it? I am an economics professor. I have a PhD in economics from Yale, which I am now using to nitpick the economics of a children's book. Look at me now, Mom. By calling it a children's book, I've probably lost some credibility with you. So let me get my Harry Potter street cred back. I have been a Harry Potter fan since December 1998. And for those of you who know your Harry Potter history, the American version was published in September 1998. In fact, here is my first edition, first print run copy of Harry Potter that I got for Christmas. You can see the little details to let you know it's a first print run. I can open it up. I can show you there. I got this Christmas, December 1998, fell in love, and I have been a Harry Potter fan ever since. I couldn't find how many books were printed in that first print run, but I figure this puts me as one of the first few thousands of fans of a book that would one day be, get millions of fans. I mean, I've been in this for a long time. Does that really affect the analysis that I'm going to put out in this video? No, not really. Is it a flex? Absolutely. What I'm trying to say is that looking at the economics of these books is not some way for me to say that these books are dumb and that you shouldn't be reading them. I love these books. I'm sharing these books with my kids. These books have been part of almost my entire life. I don't want to say like these books are dumb, but it's just fun. It's looking at the economics lens is just a great way to look at these books. So this will be an extensive look at the economic principles in Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone and Philosopher's Stone if you're on, wherever you are in the world. When deciding what to cover, I had like two principles that I was going for. First, was this like some sort of interesting economic concept that I could illustrate through what's going on in Harry Potter? And second, is it some interesting economic part of the world building, like the wizarding world and what's going on? How does that go into the economics? And these two are obviously going to intersect. But in case you're not interested in everything I have to say, I've set up little chapters so that way you can skip to the section that you're interested in. If you want to share those chapters with people who are studying economics or your economics professor, whatever it is, I'm trying to make it as simple as possible so that way you can go ahead and get that out there. And of course, warning, like I'm going to be using some Harry Potter spoilers in these videos. Like we're going to focus only on Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone in this one, but I'm probably going to refer to plot points that come along throughout the entire series, all the way through Deathly Hallows. So, this Deathly Hallows came out 17 years ago. So if you need a spoiler warning, it's there. Just go read the books and come back and watch these once you're done. First, just some kind of general big picture comments on the economics in these books and especially the world building. When I was calling it a children's book, I wasn't trying to be derisive. The first book is indisputably a children's book, and it is given from a child's perspective of the wizarding world. And children just don't notice that much about the economics of the world. My son has no idea what the Federal Reserve is. My daughter isn't examining trade deficit. So when their life stories are told from their limited perspectives, we can't expect them to capture all the economic details or the economic institutions they're coming in and influencing that world. In the same way, our understanding of the economics of the wizarding world are going to be limited by the fact that most of our understanding is being filtered through the insights of a child. So there will be many times when I give the world building a pass because we wouldn't expect a child to notice some of those details, but there are details that seep through that give us an idea of like the actual economics going on, and those are totally the places where I want to jump in and just really roast it and try to understand what's going on. The other important fact that I want to comment on world building seems to be just a general decision that J.K. Rowling has made as she goes through it. It reminds me of something Brandon Sanderson said. He has this rule for world building on the margins.
Sanderson's zeroth law is where stories begin. And Sanderson's zeroth law is always err on the side of what is awesome.
If that's Brandon Sanderson's rule, then J.K. Rowling's rule is err on the side of quirky. From the first page, the first lines, it's clear that that normal, predictable, conventional choices are the most muggle thing that you can do. To be a wizard is to be quirky. And that means sometimes the world building isn't about what makes sense in the economics, but what makes sense in the wizarding world quirkiness of it all. And I think that's fun. And I actually think there's an explanation for that. And I will get to that at the end of this video. But let's go ahead and roast some stuff on the way there. Have you ever paid attention to the first things Harry learns about in the wizarding world? Obviously, the first thing he hears about is Hogwarts. But after that, what does he start to learn about? The very first thing he does as an initiate in the wizarding world is pay for a newspaper with wizarding money. Before even learning that wizards have a government, he learns that the wizarding world has its own bank. And the first place that he visits before he even sees the school is a wizarding marketplace. It's not a coincidence that the first places that we see in the wizarding world are the economic institutions. It would have been easy to just plop Harry into Hogwarts and get more time in school. But then it would have seemed more like Dunder Mifflin and The Office. Michael, Jim, and Pam, their entire lives are just contained within that Scranton office park. It feels weird that they don't have lives outside of there, that all of their friendships, all of their romance, it all takes place in this little world. It feels very small. In the same way, if Harry was just whisked away to Hogwarts, it would feel like the wizarding world was really small. But when you introduce a market in your world building, you immediately expand the world. When Harry sees stores selling owls, dragon livers, parchment, bat spleens, and broomsticks, you know that market wouldn't exist unless people were buying those things. The same thing happens when you go to a new town. Markets foster diversity. You go around and see there's an Indian restaurant, a halal market. There's a psychic that tells you something about that city without having to actually get to know anyone in there. A lot of writers focused on world building like to make their world seem established by, detailing the religions or mythology of the world. It's an awesome idea, but it takes a lot of effort. With very little effort, J.K. Rowling has used the familiar abstraction of a market to let your mind fill in the details of the world and believe it's much larger than she's actually given you. So this isn't a roast as much as it is an appreciation of what a few economic details can do for world building. Also, I think it's super interesting that the Leaky Cauldron, the entrance to Diagon Alley, the most important wizarding marketplace that we see across the entire series, is invisible. Almost like it's a symbol of how markets are the invisible hand that organize our economy. But when we want to get to a roast, let's talk about wizarding money. That's just the most obvious place to start, and a place where people have already brought up issues with what they see in the books. Now, I went through and did some of my own analysis. I went and looked online a little bit, and I wasn't really seeing people talk about the things that I found. So even if you're familiar with what some people have talked about with the issues of money in the wizarding world, I think I have some new stuff for you. The wizarding world has 3 coins: galleons, sickles, and nuts, and they're made from 3 different metals: gold, silver, and bronze. This shows that they are at least on a bimetallic standard because they're accepting gold and silver as legal tender. Many countries throughout history have used metal standards for their currency because they keep the value stable and they keep inflation under control. In fact, we know a couple of things about inflation in the wizarding world with Quidditch Through the Ages. We have 2 major insights on inflation. First, the first Quidditch match to use a snitch, which they called a snidget because that was the bird, happened in 1269, and the prize was 150 galleons for catching the snidget. And that's why today you get 150 points for catching the snitch. In the description of that game, there's a footnote that says 150 galleons back in 1269 was worth more than 1 million galleons today. And, it's hard to judge the exact publication date of this. I mean, this book itself came out in 2001, but it's got notes in it by Harry and crew, so that puts it probably early 90s, a little bit before that. I mean, it's the dating of this book is a little strange, but it actually doesn't matter when you're looking at like a 700-year period. If 150 galleons in 1269 is 1,700,000 years later, that means that the wizarding world has had about 1% inflation over that entire period. But that's a pretty stable currency. The bimetallic standard is doing its job. But then there's a problem, because we learned that the 3 coins are fixed relative to each other. So there are 17 sickles in a galleon and 29 nuts in a sickle, meaning a galleon is 493 nuts. So this is the first part of the world building where I'm going to say, like, this doesn't make sense, even though I'm actually willing to give it a little bit of a pass. When I first read the book, I, was 10, and I thought the values of the coin were an example of J.K. Rowling's just err on the side of being quirky. Because, these silly wizards, they have 17 sickles in a galleon. Like, that's just weird, right? And in a way, that's right. But being American, I didn't realize that this was supposed to be analogous to England's pounds, shillings, and pence. And in the real world, the conversions between those are quirky too. Like, there's 20 shillings to a pound, 12 pence to a shilling. So that means that 1 pound is 240 pence. Like, whose idea was that? In fact, the pound, shilling, pence system was so dumb that the founding fathers of the United States, when they got independence, said, like, we're getting rid of that. Thomas Jefferson has this nice little rant about how bad the math was. The easiest ratio of multiplication and division is that by 10. Everyone knows the facility of decimal arithmetic. Everyone remembers that when learning money arithmetic, he used to be puzzled with adding the farthings, taking out the 4s and carrying them on, adding the pence, taking out the 12s, carrying them on, adding the shillings, taking out the 20s, carrying them on. But when he came to the pounds where he had only 10s to carry forward, it was easy and free from error. The bulk of mankind are schoolboys through life. Like, they just switched the money to being a base 10 money because it was easier to do the math. He said, like, schoolboys don't know how to do it unless you do the 10s. Let's just do it at the 10s. Now, arguably, one of the themes of Harry Potter is that the bulk of wizard kind are schoolboys throughout their life who can't get over things that happened to them when they were in Hogwarts. So you'd think that this schoolboy society would fix the system to make more sense. The UK did. They had this big event back in 1971 called Decimal Day, where they switched and they just said, no, a pound is 100 pence. Like, score one for muggles, I guess, for figuring out the right way to do those things. But can we also point out how hilarious it is that a society that stops teaching kids math at age 11, if they ever learned it in the first place, has such a ridiculous money system? But math isn't the only problem with wizarding money. To understand the next issues, let's just focus on the sickle and the galleon. So there's a fixed ratio between them, right? As I said, 17 sickles to 1 galleon. Now, we don't actually know the metal content of both of these, so to just simplify, let's have it be like 1 ounce of silver in the sickle and 1 ounce of gold in the galleon. That's not totally correct because there's some evidence in the books that galleons are actually pretty big, and then the nuts are the smallest, right? So there's some sort of size relationship with the value of the currency, but that would just actually make this problem way worse. So let's just assume that they're both an ounce of metal. So that means that in the wizarding world, 1 ounce of gold is the same as 17 ounces of silver. That's a problem. Right now in the real world, 1 ounce of gold is worth about 78 ounces of silver. Imagine you had 1 galleon in Diagon Alley. That means you have 1 ounce of gold. Well, if you walk right outside into London, one of the financial capitals of the world, you could basically almost immediately trade that 1 ounce of gold for 78 ounces of silver. Then you could go just right back into Diagon Alley, and you could exchange that 78 ounces of silver for 4 galleons and 9 sickles. You just turned 1 galleon into 4.5 without using transfiguration. All you did was move back and forth between the wizarding world and the muggle world. No magic, just arbitrage. And the great part is you do not have to stop there. Take those 4 gold galleons, go back out, trade it for the silver. Now you have 312 ounces of silver, bring it back into the wizarding world, and now you have 19 galleons. If you only did this 10 times, you could get to 4 million galleons. It's so easy. You don't have to cross oceans and continents. You just have to walk a few streets to do it. This mismatch between the value of gold and silver makes me think of the Great Depression of all things. Back in the 1930s, there was a lot of uncertainty about the economy, right? We're starting to get into the Great Depression. The stock exchange had crashed in 1929. Banks were closing down. And then one country did something big. Great Britain decided to get off the gold standard. And this sparked a lot of panic because people thought the U.S. was about to do the same thing. And so foreigners who held U.S. dollars started exchanging these because the U.S. was on the gold standard. So they started exchanging those paper dollars for gold. And to make good on that, gold had to leave the country. So the U.S. is leaking gold out into the world. And you can only have as much currency as you have gold when you're on a metallic standard. And so that currency started being withdrawn and you started to get deflation. And that ended up deepening the Great Depression. It's one of the big patterns that we've realized is that people who stayed on the gold standard longer were more likely to have a deeper depression and a longer recovery. The same thing should be happening in Diagon Alley. Arbitrageurs should be bleeding Diagon Alley of its gold and prices should be falling. That leads to our final part on money that doesn't make sense because we actually have some stuff about exchange rates and inflation, and you're going to see that it just doesn't match because we know the exchange rate between wizarding money and muggle money. Well, at least I know it between wizarding money and I guess no mage money because we're going to be using the American currency. So in the preface to Quidditch Through the Ages, Dumbledore writes a foreword and he says that Comic Relief, which is the charitable organization that's going to be benefiting from the proceeds of this book, had raised $250 million since 1985. And then he mentions this is the equivalent of 34 million galleons. So if we just do that conversion of $250 million to galleons, what we find out is that the exchange rate is $7.35 for 1 galleon. Now, taken by itself, okay, that's interesting. That has problems by itself when we go into some stuff later on in this video. But there's actually a second exchange rate here because on the back of the book, it gives the price under here. And it says it's $3.99 US, and that is 14 sickles and 3 nuts. If we use that exchange rate, that means that the galleon was only worth $4.81. Now, I imagine that the content in the book was written before the price was put on the back. So that means in between the time that Dumbledore writes this foreword and the price is put on the back of this book, the galleon lost like 35% of its value. That means the wizarding economy is going through inflation. That's how you lose value in the exchange rate is your currency is inflating. It's not worth as much anymore. That is totally inconsistent with being on a metallic standard as they have been. It's totally inconsistent with the history that is established in this book that shows that they've only had 1% inflation through centuries. And then like in the matter of a year, how all of a sudden like this crazy, it's not quite hyperinflation, but like very significant inflation, like that doesn't make any sense at all. So before I go on to the next economic idea, like I just have one parting comment on the money. There is a like totally missed opportunity here where there could have been a subplot where a character just gets richer and richer over the books because they're arbitraging gold with the muggles. Like ideally the character would have been like really poor at the beginning, maybe has like a really big family to support, but because he has extensive knowledge of muggles, spends his career studying them, he would realize there was this discrepancy between wizarding money and muggle money, and just spend his time arbitraging across the worlds and get filthy rich throughout the books. So after learning about Hogwarts, the first named thing that Harry learns about is Gringotts. When Hagrid first mentions it, Harry is shocked. Wizards have banks? Hagrid responds, just the one. And look at that, we already have a problem. Now, I'm going to assume that Hagrid meant that British wizards have just the one, but that's still shocking that there's only one bank in all of British wizarding world. Turns out there's a strong link between how many banks a country has and how rich the country is. This is some data that I pulled from the World Bank, and you can see that's a really strong correlation between the two. Now, I say correlation because you can imagine the relationship going either way. If a country is rich, that means a lot of people have money and they need some place to put their money, so they put them in banks. But also, banks provide important financial services, which we'll talk about, in this section. And those financial services help enable wealth. And as a result, the more banks you have, the richer your country becomes. The fact that the British wizarding world has only one bank suggests that that economy just isn't doing very much. In fact, we can use this World Bank data to kind of estimate how large the British wizarding population is. So when Harry goes into the British wizarding world, he's not commenting on how poor everyone looks. In fact, he might actually be amazed at the wealth that they have. He's not going into a third world country. We're going to say that the British living standards are pretty similar to the wizarding world living standards. That means that GDP per capita between the two worlds are about the same. And if that's the case on this graph, that means this is about where the British wizarding world is in terms of wealth. That means they should be having about 27 banks per 100,000 people. But since they only have one, that means that they must have only a population of 3,700. Now, this actually is interesting because we know that there are only 40 students in each year of Hogwarts. I know that, there are actually some reports that there are different, but in Harry's year, it's very clear that there are 5 boys and 5 girls in each of the 4 houses. So that's 40 students. And if we assume you just have 40 wizards and witches every year from between 1 and 100, that means that you actually have 4,000 wizards, which is shockingly close to this 3,700 number. So that's 2 independent calculations arriving at basically the same number. The wizarding world is not that big. So what can the story tell us about why there's only one wizarding bank? Why is there a monopoly in banking? Well, one answer could be that no other bank can compete on location. Gringotts is located right in Diagon Alley. It's one of the largest marketplaces that we know of in the wizarding world, and this provides several advantages. First, it doesn't look like wizards use personal credit to buy things. They're going directly to the bank, withdrawing cash and then spending that. And so there are going to be some locational advantages to being in the marketplace where people can, that's where people most need that cash. They can go to the bank and then go make their purchases. Also, Gringotts could be providing credit to the businesses in Diagon Alley. That's a big function that banks perform. And if you're right there giving them credit, then you can monitor them. You can make sure that if there's some problem in the apothecary, oh, they're going to have trouble making their payment this month, but it's a legitimate problem. We're not going to go after them. We'll be forgiving right now, right? You can monitor them and you're not going to see them just disappear one day. So there can be a lot of locational advantages for Gringotts to be in Diagon Alley, and maybe no other bank can be located there. And so, there's just no reason to compete. But neither of these answers is actually satisfying in the context of the story. Why would you need easy access to a bank when you can have wallets that have just, not infinite space, but certainly if you can shove everything you own into a, wallet they can hold around your neck, you could actually hold however much cash you need when you're going around making your purchases. You don't need the bank to be right there in Diagon Alley. And even if your concern was like, well, I don't want to be storing my cash in that wallet, I'd rather be someplace safe, like a bank like Gringotts. Well, like a bank could be set up anywhere in the world, and you could just like have a branch open in Diagon Alley and then just like ferry people back and forth by hooking that branch and the bank up through the Flu network, or maybe have a port key that regularly transports people back and forth. Like, I don't understand, in a world where you have these instantaneous teleportation methods, why you have to be exactly where the consumers are with your bank. And the credit to businesses also doesn't make that much sense. So it should. There's clearly some barriers to Gringotts doing this kind of stuff, because when Harry goes in to get his money, they don't just like look in an accounting book and say like, oh, this is how much money you have. How much money would you like? And they go back to like the big vault and they just pull out this money and say like, here you go. No, they take him to his personal vault. Like, when I go to the bank, that's not what they do. I go and I say like, hey, I need a couple of $20 bills. They hand me $20 bills. I don't care if they're the same $20 bills that I deposited when I went to the bank. Like, I just want $20 bills. They're the same thing. Like, when Harry goes to the bank, that personal vault, like that money in there was probably personally touched by James and Lily, and Gringotts can't touch that stuff at all, right? Like, imagine you had stored a Horcrux in your vault, and then Gringotts just like loans it out to someone. Like, that is not the kind of bank that you want. At least it seems like that's how they're running these banks, right? So like, it doesn't make sense that they would be able to go loan money out, because they're putting their money in a place that's like individualized. This is actually a really good point to mention, like, why the wizarding economy just seems like it's in such a terrible spot. And then I'll get back to like my preferred explanation for why Gringotts has a monopoly on banking. But like, the contrast I want to make is another situation where we see like a real bank in the wizarding world, and that's in Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them. You have Kowalski, who shows up at the very beginning, and he has this business idea. He wants to make a bakery. He knows it's going to be the best bakery in the world. He just needs some money to help get it started. Now, ideally, but like, you know, in a world without banks, he would just go and find somebody who has enough money, and, you know, maybe they've got like some special silver egg that they can give him and he could finance everything, right? But those kind of people, you know, probably get requests all the time for money. And so like, it's hard for them to know like who to trust. It's hard for them to vet businesses. That's a lot of time that they would be spending. And so like, they don't usually want to lend out that kind of money. So then you get some people who come along and say like, hey, all you rich people who have like too much money to do with right now, here's the deal. Give us your money, and then we're going to just like ask people who have business ideas to come and pitch their business ideas to us. And if we think that they're viable businesses, we'll give them some of this money. And, you know, they want that money so bad. Like, they think that they're going to create so much value that they're going to be able to not only pay that money back, they could pay that money back with interest. And then we'll give you some of that interest to give you more money, right? Like, this is a win-win for the entire economy. And that's what banks do, right? They're financial intermediaries. Their goal is to match money from people who have it to people who have ideas but don't have money. This is how most of the economy works, is through credit, because most of the time you need to buy something before you can sell it. Quality Quidditch supplies needs bludgers and broomsticks in stock before young wizards are going to buy them. Like, they take out a loan, sell the supplies, and then they pay that loan back really quickly. But Gringotts is not set up to do something like that when all of the money is stored in personal vaults. This is a wizarding economy where basically nothing is working. So what's my preferred explanation for why Gringotts has a banking monopoly? Well, some of you might be thinking it's a government-backed monopoly, right? That the Ministry of Magic has given the bank a charter and they're not letting anyone else enter. And that's the way a lot of banks have worked throughout history. And certainly that could be going on here. I don't like it as a preferred explanation, though, because like, I want to have like a good economic story behind it. I'm like, government-backed monopolies, I guess, have some economic story, but like, it's just a lot more fun to have like, these are the economic reasons why you have to have a monopoly. So what are the economics about the markets for banks in the wizarding world specifically that would lead to a monopoly? I think the answer is what Gringotts advertises at the front door, a poem that warns thieves that they should stay away. In fact, Hagrid mentions that Gringotts is the safest place to store anything except for, maybe Hogwarts. So that means Gringotts is essentially a safety deposit company. They protect your stuff. And there's a reason why this makes sense, because protection in the wizarding world must be so difficult because magic is involved. Imagine you want to start a bank that competes with Gringotts. You have to pay someone to enchant the thief's downfall. You need to install the biometric vault so that way when somebody touches it recognizes who they are. You need to get permits, food, and a home for your highly regulated dragons. You have to spend all of that before you can even protect the first thing that comes into your vault. But how much do you have to spend to protect the second thing? Well, basically nothing, because all of the protections you put in place for the first thing also protect the second thing. So if you've invested, let's say, 1 million galleons to protect that first thing, then the average cost of protecting one thing is 1 million galleons. But once you have two things in there, the marginal cost is essentially zero, so the average total cost is 500,000 galleons per protected thing. Put in 4 things, it gets down to 250,000 galleons. And as you get more and more things in the bank, your average total cost is going to be falling. That means that banking, or safety deposit protection, whatever you want to call it in the wizarding world, experiences economies of scale. The average total cost is falling as they do more and more. And if you have economies of scale, it's socially cheaper to just have one company doing all of this than it is to have everybody competing for it, because you can have 2 companies both spending 1 million galleons trying to do something, but then they're delivering the service at a higher average total cost. Or you could push all of it into one bank and then just have one person dominating the market. This is called a natural monopoly, because it's just natural to have one company, and it's beneficial for society in some ways to just have one company serve the entire market. That's why it's such big news when someone tried to rob Gringotts and wasn't caught. That is the entire business model being threatened. That's not good for business. I mean, Quirrell probably only got away with it because he had access to Voldemort's powers, right? Can you imagine what would happen to this business if wizards who weren't even fully trained succeeded in robbing Gringotts? It'd be awful for him. Next up is Ollivanders. Since I just talked about monopolies, I'm not going to focus on that aspect of Ollivanders. I'll just point out, however, that Ollivander is not the only wand maker. He's just regarded as the best. So it's not a monopoly, it's monopolistic competition. That means there are brands, and Ollivanders has a premium brand, which means he can charge premium prices. So Harry arrives in the wand shop, and he goes through the process of finding a wand. There's a unique wand for each wizard. Ollivander takes some measurements of Harry. Then there's some experimentation with wands. Finally, the correct wand is found. I mostly don't have a problem with this, but have you ever thought about how many wand combinations there are? What is the total market for wands? Well, there are 3 characteristics of a wand: its core, its length, and its wood. We know Ollivander uses 3 cores: Phoenix Feather, Unicorn Tail Hair, and Dragon Heartstring. And there are different lengths. Now, as I was going through trying to look in wikis and figure out the range of lengths, the shortest one I found was 8 inches, and the longest I could find was 18 inches. And you would find measurements that were at quarter inches. So let's just assume that you can get any length of wand between 8 and 18 inches, down to a quarter inch of a size. That means there are 41 different lengths. Now, woods was a little bit harder, but wizardingworld.com does list out all the woods that Ollivander uses, and it turns out there are 38 of them. So if you do 3 times 41 times 38, that means there are 4,674 unique combinations of wands. Now, if there's only one combination that is your destined wand, and each wand was tried randomly, so you just pick a random wand, try it out, you take it away, try another one, you would have to try 2,337 wands before finding yours on average. But I don't think Ollivander is choosing randomly. Harry comes in and Ollivander starts taking measurements of him. So there's something about his physique that updates his ideas about like which wand he's going to use. Even if like your physique as an 11-year-old, I don't know how, indicative that is of your magical capability when you're an adult, but whatever. So like there's something that he can do to narrow that search space. So if he can like pick a wand and cut the search space in half each time, like, if this happens, you must be over on this direction. If this happens, you gotta go that way. You just keep cutting it in half. Like, you could find your wand in about like 12 different wands. And like that makes a lot more sense. So after finding his perfect wand, Harry learns about its unique history, and then he pays 7 galleons. This part doesn't make sense. We have a few references for how much this must be. So if we use those exchange rates that I calculated from Quips Through the Ages, that would be like at the high end, like the most it would be was like $51.45. Maybe we don't trust these exchange rates. That seems way too cheap. So let's use an in-universe price comparison. So Harry, when he paid for that newspaper, paid the owl 5 nuts, which means 7 galleons could buy you newspapers for 690 days, which is about 23 months, just shy of 2 years, right? If I compare that to a New York Times subscription, so if I just go on like right now and say like how much would it cost for me to get the New York Times to my house every day, that's about $1,000 US right now. That sounds more reasonable, but I still think it's too low. Like Ollivander is basically an orthodontist. You're making this investment in a middle school aged kid and saying like, hey, we're going to pay a ton of money right now, but that's going to pay off for the rest of your life. So yeah, we're going to invest in getting that wand. And braces can cost like anywhere between $3,000 and $10,000. And this is one of the best wand makers in the world. He should be charging at the top of that range. But I don't think that's the value of 7 galleons, because when Harry is on the Hogwarts Express and he goes and buys all that candy, the amount he spends is about 10% of 7 galleons. And so if you take 10% of each of these prices, like, yeah, maybe he's not responsible with his money, but I highly doubt that he's spending like $1,000 on candy in the train. Like, it's more reasonable that he's spending $5 or maybe like $100 on candy. So it's probably more towards that range. So it's probably like around $1,000 at the top end. And even then, I think that's just too low of a price for a wand. And that actually leads to the craziest part of this. Ollivander is actually the first and maybe only wizard throughout the entire series where we can approximate an annual income. Wizards are probably occasionally breaking their wands and needing some repairs or, some checkups on their wands. But it's got to be that Ollivander is making the bulk of his money when those students are coming in every year buying their first wand. Now let's just assume that like everybody goes to Ollivanders to buy their wands. That means there's 40 students buying wands each year, each one for 7 galleons, which means like the bulk of his salary is 280 galleons. Again, like we can go through the different values of galleons and try to figure out what this is at that low range. When we're using that $7.35 exchange rate, that means that he's making about $2,058 a year, which is not that much for the best wand maker in the world. If we use the price of the newspaper, right? So we say that 7 galleons is about $1,000. That means he's making $280,000 a year. That sounds like way more reasonable. But if we accept that number, then that means the Triwizard Tournament, the prize of 1,000 galleons, was actually $1 million. And, there are aspects of the Triwizard Tournament that look like a Mr. Beast challenge, but I don't think that the wizarding world was tossing out that kind of money to kids. I think the question of how much the value of everything is in the Harry Potter books is like really up in the air. Maybe as we're going through these videos, I'll get hone in on what the actual value of this money is. Okay, wow, we haven't even left Diagon Alley. So the next location is the Hogwarts Express. This is where we confirm one of the most important themes throughout the series. We already get a hint of this at the beginning of the books, right? Like with the Dursleys, Dudley's birthday brought loads of presents, while Harry's birthday is always forgotten. Dudley got a large chocolate ice cream at the zoo, while Harry got a lemon popsicle. Dudley gets 2 bedrooms, while Harry gets the cupboard underneath the stairs. Now we get into the wizarding world, and even though there's magic, there's still this problem. Malfoy comes from money, while Ron is coming out of poverty. One of the biggest themes throughout this book is inequality, and that's not surprising given, what J.K. Rowling's life was like when she was writing these books. I think this is a super interesting theme to explore. It's super relevant for talking about economics, but I actually think that Chamber of Secrets does a way better job at dialing into this theme, so I'm going to save that discussion for the next video. Harry arrives at Hogwarts, and what's the first thing he learns? Is it what subject he's studying? Is it where the classes are? No to either of those. The first thing he learns is that there are 4 houses, and the houses receive points. His triumphs earn points, and his rule breaking loses points. At the end of the year, the house with the most points wins the House Cup. Once again, the first thing that we're learning about this wizarding world is an economic institution. Sometimes when you're doing these kind of videos of finding economics in pop culture, you really have to warp it to be yeah, this is the economic principle we're having here. But that's basically all we've been exposed to in Harry Potter so far, is just economics on every page. Why does Hogwarts have these economic incentives? Well, it reminds me of my high school Spanish class. It's my sophomore year, and we have this brand new teacher from Argentina. She obviously speaks Spanish perfectly. She does not teach Spanish perfectly. And you know how high schoolers are. As soon as they sense some sort of weakness, they're like nifflers going after leprechaun gold. It wasn't a very pleasant class. And to make things worse, we had 2 class clowns in there. And these were the class clowns for the entire school. And they would just every day come in with elaborate pranks and skits. One time they did Abbott and Costello's Who's on First in Spanish, just burst out of it in the middle of class. They were just going crazy. I did not learn much Spanish that year. It was bad. Now, from personal experience, just like I do, but there are plenty of studies out there that have established that disruptive students hurt their peers' learning. And this is where the house points come in. This system solves 2 problems. First, you want to give an incentive on personal effort. You reward students who prepare for class, and you punish students who do not. It's very straightforward. It's pretty obvious why they're doing this. But if that's all you want to do, you could just give them grades, which they do. So why is it house points? Well, because disruptive students affect their peers' learning. But it's hard for the professors to police all the bad behavior. So you deputize the peers. Economists called the bad behavior an externality. The disruptor does not bear the full costs, right? Yeah, I'm getting a bad grade, but I'm also lowering everyone else's grade, and I don't take in that cost. And so because I don't have to pay for that, I do more disruptive behavior than society wants me to do. So the point system is a way to get the disruptor to realize that his behavior is affecting others, and it's a way to get the students to have an incentive to stop that bad behavior. Now, it's not fine-tuned to get the peers to punish each other. The points are added to the hourglass anonymously. We know this because when Harry and Hermione get caught smuggling Norbert outside the castle, no one knows how Gryffindor lost 150 points in one night. You only know who lost the house points if you were there when the assignment happens. But some people know, and gossip flies around Hogwarts faster than a Nimbus 2000, so it becomes common knowledge pretty quickly. And the system works. When Harry and friends try to go stop Snape from getting the Sorcerer's Stone, they're stopped by Neville. And he doesn't say, you're going to get in trouble. He says, Gryffindor will be in even more trouble. He wants to stop their bad behavior because of the tangible effect it has on the rest of the house. Incentives work. I definitely have more to say about points in future videos. One of the events in the first book is so trivial that even hardcore fans might forget about it. But it is relevant to some pretty big issues in later books. In fact, there are some pretty important plot points related to this issue in each of the last 3 books. 4, really? What was it? I think it's the last 4 books, actually. So during broom lessons, Malfoy steals Neville's Remembrall. Harry chases him, Malfoy drops it, and Harry nearly catches it before it breaks. Instead of getting punished for riding a broom when he wasn't supposed to, Harry gets put on the Quidditch team. Malfoy's upset, so he later challenges Harry to a duel at midnight. Harry and Ron leave the common room with Hermione, reluctantly in tow, trying to get them not to lose points for Gryffindor because incentives work. Then the twist. Malfoy is a no-show, and he's even snitched on Harry. The gang narrowly avoids getting in trouble. This demonstrates some important principles in contract theory. It's important for any market transaction. In fact, when you realize that somehow we deal with this on a daily basis, you might wonder, like, how in the world does the economy function at all? Suppose someone hires you to tutor them, probably in economics, because you're just like so good at it that you're consuming economics content in your free time. You go through a big tutoring session right before the big exam, and then they promise to Venmo you. But they never do. They get the full benefit of the tutoring session, they do well on the exam, and you bear all the costs. This is an example of opportunistic behavior in contracts. Like, we rarely have transactions that happen simultaneously, where the buyer and seller do the thing at the same time and exchange them. When you buy something on Amazon, you pay first, and then Amazon sends you your Sorting Hat Squishmallow. You put 2 weeks of work in, and then you get a paycheck. But Amazon could take your money and never send you your package, and your boss could take your labor and never deposit your check. Here, Harry and Malfoy made a contract, and Malfoy didn't hold up his side of the deal. We fixed this by making the cost of breaking your contract much higher than the benefit of breaking it. And one way we do this is through reputation. If you are breaking your contracts, people are going to know that you're the kind of person that doesn't keep your contracts. And people don't want to do business with you. For example, I once had a company agree to pay me for a plug in a video, but then they never paid. And you know what? That company ended up going out of business. Karma. Sometimes it's hard for individual consumers to impose high costs on businesses. So instead we have things like the legal system that allows us to sue them, or we have other mechanisms that allow us to force them to keep up their end of the contract. One time my wife and I needed to make a time-sensitive $2,000 purchase, and then we realized that like there was something that had shifted, and so we had to, change some of the details of that purchase. We called the company. We said, like, hey, what were we supposed to do? They said, well, since it's time sensitive, purchase the new one, and then we'll just give you a refund on that old one. But, make sure you get that new one because you want to lock in that deal as you can. So we bought the new one. We filed for the refund on the old one. And then after like a really long time, I want to say a couple weeks of trying to get this refund, they were just constantly saying like, oh, nope, that's something we can't do. You have to go talk to someone else. We go talk to them. They'd say, nope, go back to that person. It was just back and forth. It was awful. And so what we did is we just went to the credit card company and we disputed the transaction. We said like, hey, you can see bottom, this is a refund. They're not willing to refund it. So we're just going to dispute this transaction. And the credit card company canceled it. Like, we had a big company that was able to enforce that contract for us. But these mechanisms only work when you're following the rules, at least largely, right? When Malfoy gets away with his opportunistic behavior because Harry has no mechanism to hold him accountable. What's he going to do? Go to McGonagall and say like, hey, Malfoy didn't show up for our midnight duel. Deterring opportunistic behavior is really hard when you're doing something illegal. I mean, you can go mafia style and threaten to break their legs or something, right? But like, it gets really hard to get those mechanisms unless you have some sort of power yourself. And that's a problem that needs to be resolved multiple times throughout the series. And we'll see how they do it. There are plenty of things that I could talk about in this book, but like a lot of them appear in other books. I think I'm going to save some of those discussions for later. To wrap this all up, I want to talk about the cost of magic. By the end of the book, we learn indirectly that we can classify magic into 3 cost categories. We have wand magic, potions, and unicorn blood. The wizard does not pay any cost when using wand magic. Apparently, once you buy the wand, you can use it without any problems. Maybe you can account for like the cost of learning spells. But for the most part, like once you have that spell, you have the wand, you know the spell, you can just do it as much as you want. So wand magic has like a low fixed cost and 0 marginal cost. Then you have potions. For any potion, you need ingredients, and those ingredients are scarce. In fact, ingredients are one of the first prices we see in Diagon Alley, like a unicorn horn costs 21 galleons, and you got a scoop of like beetles or something that, costs a couple nuts or something. On top of that, potions can take time. So we can classify potions as being like a high marginal cost magic. Then we have unicorn blood. Frenzy explains that unicorn blood curses you as soon as you use it, and you're destined to live but half a life. Mars is bright tonight. But I don't think the curse gets worse the more you use it. I think as soon as you use it, you might as well just like keep using it. And I think this is similar for like Horcruxes and the Resurrection spell, right? Like there's a big cost up front, but then like you just kind of live your life with that big cost that you paid. So Unicorn Blood, we're going to classify as this magic that is high fixed cost. I wish these categories had been explored more. It's interesting to think about how the cost of magic could have created conflict. I mean, it does create conflict in the second book, I guess, but like that's not a central conflict throughout the whole thing. I think that a division of like the cost of magic would have been a more interesting way to divide classes than something like charms and transfiguration, where like sometimes it's like not clear what the difference is between those two. Like the chess set at the end, like is that it's transfiguration, but like it seems like a charm to me. Or maybe the cost of magic is what distinguishes like beginner magic from advanced magic. Imagine if every time you had to cast a Patronus, you lost your happy memory, or maybe it just gets tinged with sadness. Like that's pretty dark for a children's book, but like they did it in Inside Out, so you could make it work. But at least there's a part of the world building that's consistent with the cost of magic. With demand curves, as the price falls, the quantity demanded increases. And as it gets to zero, like you could potentially have the quantity demanded go all the way out to infinity. And what does that look like for magic? Well, it means that you use magic for the most trivial purposes. You make a pineapple tap dance across your desk. You transfigure a mouse into a snuff box. The fact that magic is free means that when a wizard faces a choice, he can say, when in doubt, err on the side of quirky. I have more videos on the economics of Harry Potter coming out, so make sure you subscribe. You can also get my newsletter if you go check in the description.